In the turbulent Stuart court of the early 17th century, one-man-shaped empires dictated the flow of treasury funds and ignited wars that would fracture a kingdom. George Villiers, the first Duke of Buckingham, deemed the handsomest bodied man in all of England, rose from minor gentry with no inheritance to become the most powerful man in Britain, second only to the king in under a decade. His story is not a fairy tale of royal favour, but a dark account of how personal intimacy becomes political weaponry and unchecked ambition can push a nation towards civil war. To understand the magnitude of George Villiers' influence, one must look past the glittering portraits and the high-flown titles. Centuries after his death, a 2004 discovery sheds fresh light on his relationship with the monarchy. That year, as restoration of Apethorpe Palace in Northamptonshire began, architects and historians stumbled upon a hidden passage that fundamentally reframes the history of the English monarchy. This secret corridor physically linked the bedchamber of George Villiers directly to the bedchamber of King James I. This discovery marks a critical transition. It turns Villiers' story from interesting court gossip into a tale of profound political stakes. It reveals that his power depended not only on public appointments or his attendance at the council table, but also, perhaps most crucially, on a level of physical and emotional proximity that bypassed institutional safeguards. The secret passage gave Villiers access to the king's ear at any hour, effectively creating a shadow government in which major decisions on war, peace and taxation could be made unseen by Parliament or the traditional nobility. The revelation of this corridor therefore prompts a deeper question. What are the consequences for the state when its constitutional boundaries are dissolved by a private bond? The impact of this hidden intimacy was not confined to personal intrigue. It planted the seeds of a revolution that generations later would cost James's son his head. George Villiers' remarkable ascent began in Brooksby, Leicestershire, on August 28, 1592, as the second son of Sir George Villiers and Mary Beaumont. The Villiers, a minor gentry family, faced poor prospects after the death of its father in 1606. Lacking wealth, George relied on physical charm, which his mother saw as their greatest asset. Mary Beaumont, known for ambition, groomed George for court life, sensing his aptitude for royal circles. She sent him to France in 1609, and there he honed courtly skills, fencing, dancing and equestrianism, returning in 1614, transformed from country squire to a refined courtier, ready to attract a king famed for admiring male beauty. Villiers gained his chance in August 1614 during a royal hunt at Apethorpe. At the time, King James I's current favourite, Robert Carr, Earl of Somerset, had grown arrogant and made enemies, including Queen Anne of Denmark and the Archbishop of Canterbury. Seeking a new face to sway the king and break Carr's dominance, these rivals backed 21-year-old George Villiers. Villiers was appointed royal cupbearer, serving meals and gaining intimate access to the king. His wit and appearance quickly delighted James. By 1615, Villiers had replaced Carr as the king's closest confidant, as most historians believe, his lover. Villiers' rapid promotion was unprecedented, rising from commoner to duke in under 10 years. The real power lay not just in titles, but in gaining control of key state officers. This rise stemmed from deep emotional ties. James called Villiers his sweet child and wife, and defended his favouritism by comparing his love for Buckingham to Jesus' love for the disciple John. "I love the Earl of Buckingham more than anyone else," Villiers called the king, "dear dad and gossip," signing letters as his most humble slave and dog. But this affection came at a national cost. Villiers used his position to enrich his entire extended family. He secured his mother the title of Countess of Buckingham in 1618, and while distant relatives gained lucrative marriages or government posts, this monopoly of favour alienated the old elite, who resented their displacement by an upstart family. In 1623, Buckingham undertook the notorious Spanish March. For nearly a decade, King James sought a union between his son, Charles, and the Infanta Maria Anna of Spain, in exchange for a large dowry and prospects of peace. But when talks stalled, Buckingham and Charles plotted to go to Madrid incognito to win the princess. They departed in February 1623 as Thomas and John Smith. Disguised to avoid detection, the journey across France endangered the prince's life. Arriving in Madrid, Ambassador John Digby was stunned to see the Marquis of Buckingham bearing a bag with the heir waiting outside. The mission proved to be a failure. The Spanish court was unsettled by the Englishman's lack of formal protocol and their disregard for the Catholic monarchy's rigorous religious customs. Buckingham's direct disagreements with the Spanish favourite, the Count Duke of Oliveras, undermined further diplomatic progress. The Spanish also misinterpreted Charles's visit as a sign he was considering conversion to Catholicism, a requirement Charles would not accept. Despite the failure, England celebrated the pair's return, relieved that a Catholic marriage had been avoided. Buckingham and Charles, humiliated, then pressured King James to declare war on Spain in 1624, showing the favourite's influence now surpassed the king's. After James I's death in 1625, Buckingham retained power as the favourite of the new king, Charles I. Charles, inseparable from Buckingham since Spain, relied on him for advice and command, a decision that proved disastrous for England's military. As Lord High Admiral, Buckingham had no combat experience, yet insisted on leading major campaigns. The first major campaign was an assault on Cadiz to capture treasure ships and hurt Spain's economy. Buckingham mustered 105 ships and 15,000 men, mostly pressed criminals and unfit recruits. The ships were in poor condition, the flagship Anne Royal constantly leaked, and the Lion returned home early. Landing at Cadiz, troops lacked food and water. Finding wine vats, they became too drunk to fight or retreat. Commander Sir Edward Cecil, appointed by Buckingham, was a seasoned soldier but had no naval experience. The expedition retreated in disgrace, capturing nothing and losing 7,000 men to disease and starvation. Buckingham led the next campaign in person, an attempt to relieve the besieged Huguenots at La Rochelle by capturing the island of Ré. During the final desperate assault on the fortress of Saint-Martin, the English attackers discovered that their siege ladders were several feet shorter than the fortress walls. The retreat was ignominious. Out of a force of 7,000 men, over 5,000 were lost. As military failures mounted and the national debt spiralled out of control, the English public began to look for supernatural explanations for the Duke's hold over the king. Popular opinion turned toward Dr. John Lamb, an astrologer and quack physician who served as Buckingham's personal advisor. Lamb, known as the Duke's Devil, was rumoured to be using black magic to manipulate royal decisions and to assist Buckingham in his legendary womanising. The fear of Lamb's diabolical influence was so pervasive, it was blamed for the 1626 whirlwind on the Thames that allegedly unearthed corpses. Despite the Duke's protection, the public took matters into their own hands in June 1628. A mob of apprentices in London caught Lamb leaving a theatre and stoned him to death. Following his murder, a chilling chant echoed through the streets of London. Let Charles and George do what they can. The Duke shall die, like Dr. Lamb. This event was a violent warning that the public's frustration had transitioned to a revolutionary fervour. The political fallout of Buckingham's failures led to a direct confrontation between King Charles and his subjects. When Parliament attempted to impeach Buckingham in 1626 for corruption and incompetence, Charles chose to dissolve the body rather than see his friend disgraced. To fund his ongoing wars without parliamentary approval, Charles implemented forced loans and imprisoned those who refused to pay. This triggered a constitutional crisis that culminated in the 1628 Parliament forcing the king to assent to the Petition of Right. This landmark document provided individual protections against arbitrary imprisonment, the unconsented levying of taxes, and the forced billeting of soldiers. While Charles accepted the petition to get the subsidies he needed, the House of Commons simultaneously drew up a remonstrance, specifically naming Buckingham as the prime cause of all the nation's ills. The message was clear: there would be no peace in England as long as George Villiers remained in power. The end of the great favourite came not through the law but through a single fatal blow. On the morning of August the 23rd, 1628, Buckingham was at the Greyhound Inn in Portsmouth, preparing for the third expedition to La Rochelle. But as he emerged from his quarters after breakfast, he was surrounded by a crowd. John Felton, a melancholic and disgruntled lieutenant who had been wounded at Ile de Ré and was owed £80 in back pay, stepped through the crowd and plunged a dagger to Buckingham's chest. Buckingham jumped up, cried out "villain," and briefly attempted to pursue his attacker before collapsing dead. Felton did not attempt to escape. He surrendered calmly to the Duke's men, admitting, "I am the man." Inside his hatband, Felton had sewn a note declaring that his act was one of personal and national redemption, insisting that the man is cowardly base, that he's not willing to sacrifice life for the honour of his God and king and his country. Felton was eventually hanged at Tyburn, but his action had fundamentally changed the political landscape. Rather than reuniting the king and parliament, the public's joy at Buckingham's death deeply wounded Charles I and increased his distrust of his subjects. The death of George Villiers did not resolve the tensions in England. It merely left a vacuum that King Charles filled with an even more stubborn adherence to his royal prerogative. In the decade that followed, Charles ruled without Parliament for 11 years, a period known as the Personal Rule. The grievances that had been centred on Buckingham were now aimed directly at the king himself. George Villiers remains one of history's most enigmatic figures, a man whose physical beauty and personal charm gave him the power to rule a kingdom, yet whose lack of expertise and unchecked ambition brought that same kingdom to the edge of ruin. He was a great patron of the arts, commissioning masterpieces from Peter Paul Rubens and Anthony van Dyck to cultivate an image of Venus and Adonis with his wife, Catherine Manners, to counter rumours of his homosexuality. Yet his greatest monument was not made of canvas or stone, but of the political wreckage he left behind. The handsomest bodied man in England was buried in Westminster Abbey, in a chapel usually reserved for royalty, with an inscription that calls him the enigma of the world. For the Stuart dynasty, he was the beginning of the end.